Late November 1941, west of Moscow. The air is sharp enough to sting the lungs. Snow lies thin over churned earth, crusted where boots have stamped it hard. In the tree line, engines idle in short, nervous bursts, then fall silent again, as if sound itself might draw fire. Men crouch in shallow pits cut into frozen ground, hands wrapped around rifles and hot metal mugs that cool too fast. Ahead, the horizon is a dull smear of smoke and winter cloud. Behind, a city waits with its lights dimmed and its windows taped, listening for the front to break. Here, the war compresses into a few roads, a few villages, a few hours of daylight, and into one question: whether the enemy's forward motion can be stopped. Every day, we tell real stories from World War II. By subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell button, you help preserve these stories for future generations. The road to the gates. On 22nd June 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union began with a scale and violence unmatched in European history. 3 massive army groups crossed the frontier. To the north, toward Leningrad. To the south, toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. In the center, the main weight of the attack, Army Group Center, drove east along the shortest route to the Soviet capital. The opening months were catastrophic for the Red Army. Entire formations were encircled. Command structures collapsed faster than they could be rebuilt. By July and August, German armored columns had already advanced hundreds of kilometers. The Wehrmacht's operational doctrine, rapid penetration followed by deep encirclement, appeared to be working exactly as planned. Moscow, at first, was not the immediate objective. Hitler's directives in the summer of 1941 prioritized the destruction of Soviet field armies and the capture of economic regions. But Moscow remained the nerve center of the Soviet state, the hub of rail networks, industrial coordination, and political authority. As the weeks passed, the logic of the campaign pulled the German focus back toward the capital. By late September, German planners believed the moment had arrived. On 2nd October 1941, Operation Typhoon was launched, the final offensive intended to seize Moscow before winter. 2 massive armored pincers moved east from Smolensk, aiming to encircle Soviet forces west of the city and open the road to the capital. The initial results were brutal. Near Vyazma and Bryansk, Soviet armies were surrounded in enormous pockets. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The defensive lines west of Moscow fractured under the weight of the assault. German commanders reported the Soviet front was disintegrating, but the advance came at a cost. The distances were immense. Roads turned to rivers of mud as autumn rains set in. Fuel and ammunition lagged behind the spearheads. Infantry marched on blistered feet, weeks behind the tanks they were meant to support. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Even so, the German advance continued. By mid-October, the outer defensive belts of Moscow were under threat. Panic spread through the city. Government offices were evacuated east. Factories were dismantled and loaded onto trains. Civilians dug trenches and tank ditches in parks and along avenues. The assumption, inside and outside the Soviet Union, was that Moscow's fall was only a matter of time. As October slid into November, the battlefield narrowed. Fewer roads, fewer reserves, fewer chances to recover from a mistake. And into this collapsing center, the Soviet leadership turned to a commander, known for one trait above all others: his refusal to yield ground once a line was drawn. Collapse, reserves, and the man sent to stop it. By the end of October 1941, the Soviet defensive system west of Moscow was in fragments. Entire armies had ceased to exist as coherent formations. Units arrived at the front without rifles, without winter clothing, sometimes without officers. The road, network, leading into the capital clogged with refugees moving east and troops moving west, both under intermittent air attack. German commanders believed the Red Army had reached the limit of its reserves. Intelligence assessments concluded that Moscow could be taken with one final effort before winter made large-scale operations impossible. The assumption was simple. The enemy had nothing left. That assumption was wrong. Behind the broken front, the Soviet High Command had been building new formations at an extraordinary pace. Divisions were raised from reservists, factory workers, and militia units. Training was brief, equipment was uneven, but numbers were growing. More importantly, cohesion was slowly being restored. In early October, as the situation deteriorated, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was transferred to the defense of Moscow. He had already earned a reputation as a commander, willing to impose order at the cost of unpopularity. His earlier role in stabilizing fronts and organizing counterstrokes had marked him as a man used when failure was not an option. Zhukov inherited chaos. Front lines that existed more on maps than on the ground. Commanders who had lost contact with their units. Soldiers who had been retreating for weeks without pause. His task was not to win immediately, but to stop the collapse, to buy time. Defensive belts were reorganized into depth rather than a single thin line. Strong points were established along key roads and approaches, anchored on villages, forests, and rivers. Units were instructed to hold positions as long as possible, then fall back in order rather than rout. Space would be traded for time, but only in controlled measures. As November advanced, the weather changed. The mud froze solid. Movement became easier, but only for those prepared for the cold. German troops, many still in summer uniforms, began to suffer frostbite and equipment failures. Engines seized, lubricants thickened, weapons malfunctioned at the Yarisei Same time, Soviet reserves continued to arrive. Some came from deep within the country. Others were transferred from the Far East, where intelligence suggested a Japanese attack was no longer imminent. These troops were better equipped for winter warfare and had not endured months of retreat. By late November, German forward elements were approaching the last defensive lines before Moscow. In some sectors, they could see the glow of the city on the night horizon. The offensive had narrowed into a final push. But the rhythm of the advance had changed. What had once been a rapid surge forward was now a series of grinding assaults against prepared positions. Each kilometre cost more than the last. Time, once Germany's greatest ally, was slipping away. And as the front tightened, the stage was set for the moment when holding would turn into something else entirely. Human and tactical human. For the men in the trenches west of Moscow, the war became smaller and more intimate. There were no sweeping maneuvers here, no long columns rolling forward. There was cold, there was hunger, there was the constant work of digging into ground that resisted every blow of the shovel. Many of the defenders were not professional soldiers. Factory workers, students, clerks. Some had been issued rifles only days before reaching the line. They learned quickly how to stay low, how to listen for armor, how to sleep in short intervals without removing boots that might freeze solid by morning. Civilians were never far away. Villages along the defensive belts emptied and refilled as the front shifted. Families shared cellars with soldiers. Women carried ammunition and food across open ground under fire. Children learned to identify aircraft by sound. Fear was constant, but so was familiarity. Units fought from the same positions for weeks, watching the same roads, memorizing the terrain, down to individual trees and bends in the path. Each successful delay, each day the enemy did not advance, became a small victory measured not in territory, but in survival. Tactical Zhukov's defense relied on denying speed. The German army was built to move. When it could not, its advantages diminished rapidly. Rather than attempting a single unbroken front, Soviet defenses were arranged in layers. Forward elements delayed and disrupted. Main positions absorbed the assault. Reserves waited to seal penetrations. Strong points were placed where the enemy had no choice but to pass. Road junctions, bridges, villages, at forest edges. These positions were not expected to hold forever. They were meant to hold long enough. Artillery, scarce but carefully allocated, was used to break up attacks at critical moments rather than dispersed along the line. Anti-tank weapons were concentrated along likely armor approaches. Infantry learned to let tanks pass and attack the following foot soldiers, isolating the spearheads. Every retreat was planned. Every withdrawal was meant to end on another prepared line. Panic was the enemy as much as the advancing Germans. By late November, the battlefield had become a series of controlled frictions. The German advance still moved, but it moved slowly and always under pressure. The question was no longer whether Moscow could be taken quickly. It was whether it could be taken at all. Technological and leadership and moral technological around Moscow. In 1941, technology didn't fail in dramatic explosions. It failed quietly. It failed by degrees. A truck that would not start. A radio whose battery died in the cold. A rifle bolt that stuck after a few shots. A tank that ran, but only until its fuel froze thick in the line. For the German army, the campaign had been designed around rapid operational tempo. That tempo depended on mechanical reliability and supply throughput. By late autumn, both were under attack from the environment and from distance. Parts wore out, tires shredded on frozen ruts. Horse-drawn transport, still essential for German logistics, suffered as animals collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. Soviet forces faced their own shortages, but they held one advantage: interior lines. The rail network behind Moscow, despite bombing and chaos, allowed men and ammunition to move in bulk to threatened sectors. The defense became a contest of logistics as much as courage. Who could keep formations fed, armed, and connected? Winter also reshaped the battlefield itself. Frozen ground made digging slower, but it made movement off-road harder for wheeled vehicles, forcing columns back onto predictable routes. Snow reduced visibility and muffled sound, but it also revealed movement, tracks across open fields that could be read like writing. In that environment, artillery became the most consistent weapon. When machines failed, shells still functioned. When engines froze, guns still fired. The side that could place accurate fire at the right moment could stop an advance, even without spectacular numbers, leadership, moral. By November 1941, leadership at the Soviet front was not merely about tactics. It was about preventing psychological collapse. Zhukov's style was blunt, orders were clear, positions were defined. Retreats, when permitted, were controlled. When forbidden, the reason was simple. Another uncontrolled withdrawal could become a rout all the way into the city. The line had to mean something. There was also a moral weight unique to Moscow. It was not just a strategic hub. It was a symbol of the Soviet state itself. Every kilometer ceded felt like a step toward national humiliation and political catastrophe. That pressure flowed down the chain of command into the trenches, into the decisions of platoon leaders, deciding whether to hold a burning house, whether to counterattack across a field, whether to abandon a position that had become indefensible. German leadership faced a different moral strain. Soldiers had marched since June under the assumption that victory would come quickly. Now winter had arrived, and Moscow still stood. The longer the offensive continued, the more it became an endurance test rather than a campaign of movement. The promise of a short war dissolved into frostbite, exhaustion, and the knowledge that the enemy was still fighting, still organizing, still bringing in reserves. The front was no longer defined by speed. It was defined by staying power. And as November closed, the final act began. When Germany reached for Moscow one last time, and the Soviet defense prepared to turn endurance into reversal. The last German reach, mid-November 1941. The ground hardens. The mud that had swallowed trucks and slowed armor finally freezes into rutted tracks of ice. For the German command, it feels like permission. The pause is over. The offensive renews itself with what strength remains. Army Group Center presses forward on multiple axes, each aimed at the same outcome, breaking the final approaches to Moscow before the cold fully takes hold. To the northwest, armored formations drive through a landscape of forests, villages, and narrow roads that force columns into long, exposed lines. Towns and road junctions become prizes, not for their names, but for what they control. The next bridge, the next supply route, the next approach along the highways leading toward the capital. Soviet positions bend, but they do not collapse the way they had in October. Every retreat leaves behind a scar. Destroyed bridges, mined roads, burned villages, artillery positions shifted backward by kilometers at night. Infantry units fight from tree lines and houses until the last possible moment, then pull back into another belt, already dug into the frozen earth. South of the city, fighting tightens near Tula. There, the German push strains against resistance that refuses to break, even as ammunition thins and men fight on short rations. The battlefield is no longer open country. It is roadblocks, barricaded streets, and fields cut by anti-tank ditches. What was once a sweep forward now becomes a series of forced entries. Near the central approaches, the Germans probe and punch at places that look insignificant on a map. Small settlements, river crossings, stretches of road bordered by woods. Soviet reserves arrive in fragments. A battalion here, an artillery regiment there. Not enough to counterattack everywhere, only enough to plug the breach that matters most today. The German front line edges closer. In some sectors, forward elements reach points from which Moscow is no longer an abstraction. The city is felt through the heavier air traffic behind Soviet lines, through the intensity of defensive fire, through the way the terrain itself seems to funnel everything toward one final destination. But beneath the appearance of forward motion, the offensive is hollowing out. Fuel arrives late or not at all. Vehicles fail and are abandoned. Infantry trudge forward on foot, separated from the armor. They are meant to support. The deeper the Germans push, the less they can sustain the push. And as November slips toward December, the last advance begins to slow. Each kilometer won at a price that cannot be paid twice. The stall and the shove backward. Early December 1941. The temperature drops sharply. Night freezes become killing cold. For men already exhausted, the weather is no longer an inconvenience. It is an enemy that cannot be flanked. German forward units attempt to resume the advance, but the rhythm is gone. Attacks that once covered dozens of kilometers now stall after a few hundred meters. Engines fail to start in the morning. Weapons jam after repeated firing. Soldiers fight with scarves wrapped around faces and hands numbed to the point where pain disappears. On 5th December, the shift becomes unmistakable. Soviet forces, which had been absorbing blows for weeks, begin to move forward. Along the Kalinin front north of Moscow, counter-offensives strike at overextended German positions. The attacks are not sweeping charges. They are methodical pushes, infantry supported by artillery, advancing into enemy units already strained by cold and supply shortages. Within days, similar actions unfold along other sectors of the Moscow front. Fresh Soviet divisions, better adapted to winter conditions, press against German flanks and rear areas. Positions that had taken days to capture are threatened from multiple directions. Roads, once used to advance, now become routes of withdrawal. For German commanders, the realization is stark. The offensive has failed, not because of a single defeat, but because the accumulated weight of resistance, weather, and logistics has made continuation impossible. Orders shift from attack to stabilization, then to controlled retreat. Units are instructed to hold ground long enough to avoid encirclement. then pull back to shorter, more defensible lines. The momentum that carried German forces from the borders of the Soviet Union to the outskirts of Moscow is gone. For the Soviet side, the moment is equally decisive. This is not yet a total victory. The fighting is brutal, confused, and costly. But the psychological barrier has been broken. The enemy is no longer advancing. In some places, he is retreating. The line that had been drawn in desperation now holds. And beyond it, the war begins to change shape, no longer defined by how far Germany can push forward, but by how much it must fight to avoid being pushed back. The immediate consequences arrive quickly. Immediate cost. The first thing that followed the stall outside Moscow was not celebration. It was counting. In the snow-filled forests and wrecked villages west of the city, units took roll in voices that sounded too quiet. Men who had been present a week earlier were now missing in the most literal sense. Lost in blizzards, buried in collapsed dugouts, lying where the front had rolled over them twice. Medical stations overflowed with frostbite and shrapnel wounds. Horses stood rigid in harness. Vehicles sat half-buried at road edges, fuel tanks empty, engines dead. The losses were immense on both sides, and historians give varying totals. One widely cited set of estimates places German casualties for the campaign around 174,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while Soviet losses are often placed far higher, hundreds of thousands, and in some tallies exceeding 1,000,000 when defensive and offensive phases are combined. Even where exact numbers differ, the shape of the outcome does not. This was a battle of exhaustion, paid for in human bodies. Operationally, the German front had to change posture. What had been an offensive aimed at a capital became a struggle to avoid being cut off on open roads. Withdrawals, some planned, some forced, pulled formations back toward shorter lines where supply could keep pace with survival. Commanders who had measured days by kilometers now measured them by whether a unit still existed at dusk. For the Soviet side, the immediate consequence was psychological as much as territorial. The feeling of inevitability, the belief that the Wehrmacht could not be stopped, broke in the frozen air west of Moscow. The Red Army had not merely endured, it had pushed back. And once that belief collapsed, the front stopped being a one-way movement. It became a contest of endurance that would stretch into the next seasons, and into decisions that would shape the rest of the war. Long shadow. The battle outside Moscow did not end the war in the east. It changed its physics. Germany's summer logic, rapid advance, decisive encirclement, political collapse, had depended on time and momentum. After early December 1941, that momentum fractured. The Soviet winter counter-offensive, opening on 5th of December, forced German units to fight for footholds they had assumed would be temporary stepping stones to the capital. The front line shifted westward in many sectors, and the German command was compelled to shorten its positions simply to keep formations supplied and coherent through the cold. The psychological impact was immediate, since for months German success had carried an aura of inevitability, an impression reinforced by the scale of Soviet losses and the speed of the earlier advance. Moscow broke that illusion. It became, in many histories, Germany's first major land defeat of the war, not because the Wehrmacht ceased to be dangerous, but because the strategic promise of a quick victory in the east was no longer believable. Inside the German command structure, the consequences tightened into decisions. The failure before Moscow amplified tensions between military leadership and Hitler's increasingly direct control. In December 1941, amid the crisis, the German army's high command saw leadership upheaval, part of a broader pattern in which operational setbacks accelerated Hitler's personal intervention in command decisions. For the Soviet Union, Moscow became proof that recovery was possible even after catastrophe. The defensive belts, the arrival of reserves, and the ability to coordinate counterblows under extreme pressure signaled that the Red Army was no longer merely absorbing defeat. It was learning how to survive it, then exploit it. Winter did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of war, one measured less by distance gained and more by the cost of holding on. And with that new reality settling over the snowfields west of the capital, the meaning of Moscow becomes clearer, not as an ending, but as a turning point that reshaped everything that followed. Moscow in 1941 did not decide the war by itself. It decided what kind of war it would become. Until the snow hardened the roads and the German spearheads began to slow, victory had looked like a matter of reach. How far engines could carry a plan before resistance crumbled. Outside Moscow, the plan met limits that maps rarely show. Supply lines that could not feed the front, machines that could not tolerate the cold, infantry that could not replace exhaustion with willpower. Logistics became as lethal as gunfire, and time became as important as territory. For the Soviet Union, the defense of the capital was not only a military act, it was a proof of endurance under conditions that should have broken any army. The line held long enough for reserves to arrive, for command to regain control, for retreat to turn into counterstroke. The war's psychology shifted. An invader that had seemed unstoppable was forced to yield. For Germany, Moscow exposed a dangerous confusion between operational brilliance and strategic sustainability. Speed could win battles, but it could not overcome winter, distance, and an enemy willing to rebuild inside the ruins. In the end, what changed west of Moscow was not just the front, it was the future, because from that winter onward, the enemy never advanced toward the Soviet capital with the same certainty again.